The heat pressed down on Crest Falls like a hand, so that even the dust seemed to sigh in the sun. Sarah Merritt stood with her back to the mercantile door, a smear of flour on the sleeve of her cotton dress, a crease of paper between two fingers. The town smelled of wood smoke, horse sweat, and the faint, greasy tang of kerosene lamps. Mrs. Polk, with her apron tied and hair pinned in the same tired bun she'd worn for 20 years, watched Sarah from behind the counter, eyes softer than her mouth. There were 2 letters in Sarah's pocket, and both felt heavier than the linen lining. One was a small, careful reply from Caleb Stone, an ad answered, a need for hands at a ranch beyond Bitterroot. The other was a slanting physician's note, Dr. Brennan's neat hand saying more in the margins than in the lines. Complications once, fever once, a warning written as if to close a door for good. Sarah had folded that paper until the crease looked like a fault in the world. She had trained herself to hold her shoulders like someone who belonged somewhere. Work had given her that posture, the steady rhythm of kneading dough, patching shirts, bearing a basket down a long path. But there were times her fingers remembered another shape, small enough to curl around a finger, a lullaby she could never sing aloud. That memory she kept folded, like the note, in a seam she only touched when she thought no one watched. On the road to Bitterroot, the land changed from the cramped familiarity of the village to the wide, slow breathing of ranch country. The wagon creaked. Sarah leaned her head against the roughened wood and watched the fields go by, tall grass, a hawk that crossed the sky with nothing guarding it. When Caleb Stone's house rose out of the earth, long eaves, a porch that had seen more winters than he had years, the air seemed to change tone, like a chord shifting. There was space here to breathe and to be seen, and that possibility frightened her almost as much as it drew her forward. Caleb met her on the porch with the same quiet as the house. He was a wide man with hands like split roots, and a face that held its soft places under a reserve. He watched her lines of labor, weighed them like a man used to measuring feed. The children came out to see, one by one. Emma first, all elbows and stare, 13 years old and already old beyond comfort. Daniel with a gap in his grin, Lucy and Thomas trailing, Grace with her serious smallness, and Samuel, who watched with trust that had not yet learned how to be guarded. Daniel, Caleb said, quick and efficient, help with the tack. Sarah, that bundles your trunk inside. We've got work for you. The first nights were thin with suspicion. Emma watched Sarah as if she kept the ledger of wrongs in her pockets.
She folded her arms when Sarah reached for the dishpan, watched the way Sarah's hands bent around an apple, watched the way Sarah's fingers smoothed the hem of her dress. Emma's eyes were the ones that pressed into Sarah most, and when they meant to hurt, they had the steadiness of accusation. Sarah's truth, or rather the truth she offered, was an easy phrase rehearsed into a shield. When the moment came, under the low lamplight after supper, when the children had been sent to bed and the house inhaled, she said it simply. "I can't have children," she told them. The words were small, the way a person states weather. Caleb didn't answer that night. He only nodded as if he accepted a fact about the world. Emma said nothing, but the look on her face tightened like a seam. It was a lie, and not the monstrous kind that turns meat cold. It was a protective thing. The physician's note in Sarah's pocket could be read by a careful mind as evidence of scars, a fever once during a delicate time, a complication that could make a woman cautious. Sarah offered that line because it closed the polite questions, and because it made her less dangerous to this family who had been bruised by loss. She had given other explanations before, silences, averted glances, but this one was a concrete thing, a reason that had roots and could be tucked into the corners of conversation. There were moments, in the early days, when Sarah felt the lie as a tightness under her ribs. The children brought extra cups to the table. They expected the body that made them breakfast to have the answer to 1,000 small needs. Sarah's hands learned the patterns of her demand, brushing Thomas's hair each morning with a patience that felt like contrition, tucking Daniel's shirt into his trousers, mending Lucy's doll dress until the seams held like promises. Her kindness was steady as a task. Devotion shaped itself in chores and late hours. She mended more than shirts. Slowly, the family gave her small things, trust in increments, a shared joke at supper, a demand for cookies, a secret about Alexander the farm dog. She learned to pick nettles and to lay them on Daniel's scraped knee as an old-fashioned medicine. She learned Lucy's favorite place to sit by the window, and the way Grace chewed the corner of her biscuit when she was thinking. There were slights, too. Emma's coldness was a stone the size of a heart you couldn't ignore. Once, after Emma slammed her door so hard the glass trembled in its frame, Sarah found the girl asleep in the barn, knees pulled close, a blanket around her shoulders.
She sat with her until the wind over the loft softened and Emma twitched less. "You don't have to watch me," Emma said at last, voice small and brill. "I don't want you to watch me," answered Sarah, and that was true. She wanted Emma to let the watching be less a measure and more a way to know. She wanted to earn something more than tolerance. The slow days were punctuated by small victories.
Calb would come in from the fields with a sack of the season's first potatoes and place them on the table, and there would be laughter without the edge of mistrust. Sarah's hands made bread that rose like a small triumph, and when she set it steaming on the table, the children would press around it as if it were an answer. Calb started staying to talk after supper, speaking about the weather, about the stubbornness of the north fence. He noticed the way the barn stayed tidier since Sarah had shown Daniel the right rhythm to sweep, a lesson in order that looked a lot like care. One morning in late summer, Samuel's cough changed. It began as a wetness in his sleep, a sound that made Sarah's hands jump to his chest with a craftsman's urgent care. He was small as a fist and brave, and when he woke with eyes like two shuttered windows, Sarah felt the old tightness in her chest, not from the lie she had offered, but from a depth of fear that went deeper, fear like a rope taut and knotted. Calb fetched Dr. Brennan from town. The physician talked in the way of people who measure life by pulses, steady, not dramatic. He checked Samuel and said words like bronchial and fever with a steady hand. He left a bottle and a timetable. They put down quilts and watched the boy sleep. They watched the rise and fall of his small ribs like a tide. The night Samuel's fever climbed, the house narrowed to the space of his breath. Outside, the wind came soft and then held, the dark a broadcloth. Sarah kept vigil. She sat by the bed, fingers in Samuel's hair, the way she had never dared to do for anyone she could not keep. She hummed a song she had learned as a child, one she rarely let her voice reach. The melody made the room a small sanctuary. Calb came in as Don fumbled at the windows. His face was carved from a night's watch. They spoke in low, small phrases, not filling the air with what could be tabulated by panic. During that long night, things that had been held folded began to crease again. Sarah found herself answering questions she hadn't known were waiting. Calb watched her with something less than suspicion, something like attentiveness, edged with worry. Emma, who had slept poorly and then popped in to see whether Samuel had coughed, caught Sarah cradling the boy in a way that made the air between them tight. "You're good with him," Emma said, voice brittle. "You're soft with him." Sarah shifted the blanket and met Emma's gaze. It felt like a challenge and a plea all at once. "Someone has to be," Sarah said. It might have been enough, an admission of purpose. But in the quiet hours, when the fever drifted and Samuel's hand relaxed around Sarah's finger, Emma's face cracked into something that looked like curiosity, then suspicion, then a protective hunger. She lingered near Sarah more than before. She watched not because she mistrusted, but because she wanted to measure the depth of feeling she feared would be taken from her family by any newcomer.
On the third morning, when the fever broke like a storm easing, a small bright thing happened. Samuel smiled with a wet face and pulled at Sarah's sleeve. The look that passed between Calb and her then was not just gratitude, it was recognition. They had weathered something together. For the first time, Calb offered not just work, but a light touch on the shoulder, a thing that felt to Sarah like a steadier place to stand. Yet beneath these days of cautious warmth, Sarah carried a secret bound to the bone of her past. She had built herself a new life out of small tasks and steady hands, but the old life was not gone. It was folded under layers. A ribbon, a small lock of hair hidden in a locket, a name written in a hand she had memorized and then tried to forget. She had kept the locket like one keeps a bruise to the palm, an evidence of something that had happened and that hurt when touched. There were nights when the house slumbered and the chores were done and only the moon was awake that Sarah unfastened a locket and fed her fingers the memory of a tiny hand. Once, when the rain had come early and the earth smelled of turned soil, she let herself remember the day she had made a choice. It had been a different town, another house of worse circumstances. She was younger and more frightened than she admits now. She had been told the child could not be kept, that there would be scandal and sharper things than the cold. She gave the baby away with hands that trembled the way a leaf does before it falls, leaving a small note she had hoped would someday be found and read as an explanation. Afterwards, she had been lighter in some ways and weightier in others. She had learned how shame could make a person small, how society's hard edges could cut deeper than a blade. And when she left that town with a trunk and a physician's note tucked in one pocket, she decided the world would accept a simple medical pronouncement easier than the messy truth of a mercy she had been forced to make. That was the lie, the shorthand version of a long inner fracture.
She had learned to call it by a word that made people glance away politely and accept her without the curiosity that could rip open old wounds. "I can't have children," she had said, because that claim was less dangerous than explaining why she had once given one away. It covered a history too raw to be born. It kept out the questions about who had the right to hold a child and the guilt of having surrendered one's own. The locket became an unnamed fulcrum in her life. She wore it beneath her dress, under the apron, always cold to the touch when she reached for it. Emma noticed her habit of smoothing the fabric at her throat. Once, when the girls were mending socks, a child's curiosity tripped on the locket and asked about it. Sarah deflected as if using the well-worn muscles of evasion, making tea and pointing to a stain to be scrubbed.
Yet these small evasions stacked until they required a ladder to climb out. The discovery that pushed everything into the open was not a thunderbolt, but a slow creak of a hinge. Emma found the locket by accident. She had been looking for a ribbon she swore she had lost, tracing the seam of Sarah's trunk, when she knocked a bit of leather loose and a stack of folded papers slid free. One paper was yellowed and small and bore a child's looped handwriting that read like a signature. "For little Mary, keep her safe." The handwriting was not Sarah's, but it bore the smell of another life. Ink, dust, the edge of someone else's conscience. The locket had lain atop the papers like a sentry, a lock of hair tucked inside, and a tiny name etched on a plate. Emma did not shout. She took the papers to the barn and sat between bundles of hay with the light slicing down in thin fingers. She read, then read again. The name, Mary, or something that elongated into the present, was written there, and with it an explanation in a quiet hand that said more or less, "I kept her for a while when her mother could not." There was a signature, and beneath it a place where the hand trembled. Emma felt as if the ground had shifted. She had been watching Sarah as a sentinel guarding the family's borders, and now there was evidence that this woman had been on the other side of a border Emma had not known existed. Betrayal rose up like smoke. Not because the past had happened, children were rescued, exchanged, kept, but because the woman who had promised a different truth had tucked this away. Emma kept the papers close and did not show them to Calb right away. She had to measure the weight of the find, to test whether it was a fault line she wanted to stand on. When she finally did bring it forward, the moment was bare as bone. Calb sat in the kitchen with his hands wrapped around a cup. The papers slid across the table like an accusation. For a long time he did not speak. He read and reread the words with the calm of a man who had been through loss and had learned how to hold grief without letting it spoil the whole. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked at last, and the question was not only for him. It was the sort of thing that demanded of a person a confession, not just of fact, but of motive. Sarah's eyes filled with water that had the taste of an old bruise. She set down the bread she had been buttering and folded her hands until they whitened at the knuckles. "I was afraid," she said. "I thought if I told the truth, they'd see me as less. I thought it would ruin whatever chance I had to belong anywhere. I lied because I wanted to be taken in, because I was so lonely I thought I would die of it. I told them I'm barren because it made the questions stop. There are words that arrive like meteorites. They strike and crack the night, leaving a charred place in the world. The revelation landed, and the house conspired to give the weight of it room."
Emma's face closed in the way of people who had been shifted from certainty to doubt. She walked away, as if to put distance between the heart she had guarded and the woman who had deceived her. "What happened to the child?" Calb asked, steadier now, because every man asks for the facts in the hope they will be arranged like kindling and easily understood. Sarah swallowed the memory she had been keeping under practice. The confession came in pieces. The younger town, the fever, the neighbor who offered refuge, the whispered bargain to leave the baby where it might be fed and clothed. She spoke of money that did not exist, of mothers who frightened with their scorn, of a decision made with hands that shook. She told them she had been told to leave, and if she remained, she would have been ruined in a way that made it impossible for her to return. "I thought I was doing the right thing then," she said. "I thought it was the only way a child might have a chance." Calb listened, and as he listened, his face revealed the shifting of a man rearranging the furniture in his mind. He spoke next of his own loss, of a wife who had been the center of his life and had slipped away, and how he had to keep things together for his children. That admission planted them together in a kind of mutual exposure. Both had pasts that were ragged and raw, and both had learned to take on the weight of a life carefully. The first reaction was of hurt. Emma retreated further into herself, putting distance where a child had once been soft in expression. The younger ones watched and were confused.
Daniel stared down at his plate, as if the stain in the wood had read her confession for him. Trust had been fractured, and fractures cut the way an old tree does under frost. "What does this mean for you?" Emma asked finally, the question not aimed only at Sarah, but at the fabric of family that might now be pulled by a new thread. "For me," Sarah said, her voice fractured. She had not planned an answer that fit the shape of judgment. "It means I was cowardly. It means I chose my fear over my truth. It means I hurt someone I loved once, and I stayed away from you because I thought you deserved honesty only if I could give more. But being honest now, even if it hurts, maybe that's the only way back." There were nights in the days that followed, when she sat in the kitchen and watched the quiet gather. She did not expect immediate absolution. She had in her calculations imagined immediate exile, or at least an honest wound. What she received instead was a complicated response. Irritation, sorrow, some days coldness, other days the small thud of normal routine. Calb did not flinch away from her, though he was not quick to show forgiveness like one sets down a kettle. He stayed near the hearth, as if he had decided that the house could contain both the revelation and the labor of making amends.
Reparation began not in grand gestures, but in the same place everything in that life had begun, in the work. Sarah rose with the dawn. She was first to milk, first to lay down the pans, first to tend the smaller children when they woke with old hurts. She answered questions the way a gardener prunes, gentle, precise, designed to coax growth rather than to bruise. When Emma would not speak, Sarah left a cup of tea by her door. When Daniel sulked, Sarah fixed his toy with a tenderness that did not ask for acknowledgement. She repaired not only cloth and boots, but the rhythm of a household. There were moments when Sarah's contrition seemed insufficient to the scale of what had been revealed. Emma would fold herself away like a map being closed, and would watch Sarah with a vigilance that made old scar tissue ache. When Sarah tried to speak of herself, Emma would cut the conversation. "We need you to earn it," the girl said once, blunt and honest, and there was no cruelty in the command, only a child's clarity. So Sarah earned trust. She stayed through long weeks of winter, through the churn and bark of work. She sat by sickbeds, not only Samuel's, but ones that came later, Grace with a fever, Thomas with a sprained wrist, and she kept steady. The children learned to test her by the small measures. Did she return a lost mitten? Did she make the bread on a day when the sky warned of rain? Those tests were not theatrical. They were the slow building of a house's acceptance, bricks laid in work and patience, and late-night presence. Calb watched this weathering, and slowly shifted his stance. He was a man who measured another man's worth by how he kept the roof from leaking, and how patience was rationed in the winter. He saw in Sarah a constancy that had nothing to do with the past she confessed. He saw hands that would stay in a difficult season, not run from it. The decision he made did not arrive like an epiphany, but like a rebar placed in mortar. He spoke to Emma in a way that did not demand forgiveness, but asked for openness to the possibility of mending. "She's done more for these children than some folk do their duty," he said one evening, when the sun stripped the west to a dull gold. His voice had the weight of the land he worked, that slow, certain voice of one who trusted time to show true things. "We can ask for accountability, and we can ask for change, but I'm not interested in punishing the one who stayed." Emma's anger did not vanish at that sentence. Forgiveness in a child is not a currency to be spent on command. It arrived later, like the first shoots in a long winter. She began in small increments to let Sarah sit at the end of the table. She would trade her blunt retorts for curious questions about the way Sarah made a stew or tied a ribbon. When they worked together in the barn, mending nets and ropes, a conversation would occasionally begin and then stop in midair, like a bird startled before it could land.
The family's first real test of the new arrangement came when a traveler from the distant town brought word. The stranger, a woman with a shawl and the look of someone who could read weather in a soul, came with a story and a name that snagged Sarah's breath. They had found out. No, they had always known. But the name was hers. It belonged to the child Sarah had given away. The woman in the shawl had heard that someone in Bitterroot had taken in a woman who once had a child named Mary. It was a small world of whispers, and the past slipped like light through seams and found them. Confrontation followed, not with accusation, but with the quiet demand of the present needing to be reconciled with the past. The woman asked for Sarah's permission to speak of it openly. She told them, in a voice that had the worn detail of someone who kept many stories, that the child, Mary, had been raised with care by a family who had loved her, who had given her schooling and steadiness. She had married and had children. The revelation did not bring triumph to Sarah. Instead, there was a hollow, a sense of the impossible fold in time that could not be ironed flat.
You gave her away, Emma said. This time not as a child railing, but as a person trying to understand the shape of another's choice. She's alive because you left her. You saved her, and you hurt her. Sarah held that like a double blade. I did both, she said. I have to live with that. I have to be honest about it now. The story that traveled back about Mary was ordinary and terrifying. She had a family. She had children who called her mother. There was no triumphant reunion in that tale, no cinematic wrenching of arms. There was instead the quiet domesticity Sarah had only glimpsed, a neighbor's laughter, a small boy's scraped knee. It was beautiful, and it was impossible. Sarah had no right to intrude. She had stolen away to build a life where she could do the small things she had once failed at, and now that truth had made her presence itself questionable. Emma, who had once been quick to guard the perimeter of a family against newcomers, found herself in the peculiar position of standing between two truths. She had loved the woman who tended their kitchen and their children, and she had also been betrayed by the lie. The result was not a neat line, but a woven fabric of anger and understanding. Sometimes she could not help to go to Sarah and speak of Mary, not to demand restitution, but because the topic had become a seam that, once opened, showed a different pattern beneath. You kept me away from asking, Emma told her one evening as they shelled peas, fingers moving with the slow economy of practiced touch. Sarah's fingers trembled as she held a pod. I thought if they knew, they'd think me lesser. I thought I'd be less fit to love. I can see how foolish that sounds.
Not foolish, Emma said slowly. Afraid. It was in those small domestic scenes that recovery happened. There was no grand absolution, no overnight transformation. Instead, there were meals eaten together, hands that did the same tasks in time, errands run for neighbors, a late harvest where Sarah and Emma and Calb worked until their shoulders ached. The children taught Sarah the secret of their laughter, and she taught them to keep their promises to the dog, and to the fences, and to one another. The locket remained, but it changed its place from secrecy to an object Sarah allowed to be seen once in a while, to be the thing around which a story might be told without spewing shame like a wound. She would show the lock of hair, and then tuck it away, explaining simply that she had a history that shaped her, and that she would not hide from them any longer. Calb's decision to stand with her was not an absolution of the past. It was an act to protect the future he could still shape. He told Emma and the others he did not approve of deception. He would not let deception become a strategy in their family. But he also spoke of the difference between the sin of omission and the one of abandoning a fight for mercy. We all do things in the dark that we think will keep us from worse light, he told them, and his voice did not excuse, but contextualized. The measure of a family isn't whether they have no cracks, it's whether they'll sleep on the roof and patch the hole when rain comes. Sarah patched holes. She made the house a place where children did not fear the dark. She stayed when winters came hard. She told stories that the children liked because they were full of animals that sounded foolish and wise. She learned the names of every bird that nested in the eaves and taught the littlest to keep a record of them. She learned to listen in a new way, to the sighs that meant hunger, to the silence that meant someone was holding sorrow inside. Slowly, the children's distance softened. Emma set down more walls. Daniel chose to sit on Sarah's knee one afternoon and fall asleep there, trust finally overriding old alarms. Grace, who had been the most watchful, started to ask Sarah to braid her hair on Sundays. The work of healing was never linear. There were days when a small slur of gossip from town slid through the post and the house shuddered. But the pattern held. Truth, admission, labor, small acts of care. There was an afternoon in late spring when a letter arrived for Sarah from a town she had not been to in years. It bore a familiar hand, the one who once kept Mary as long as she could. The letter spoke of Mary's grandchildren, of the ordinary loveliness of a life lived. There was no demand in the letter, no instruction. It was a kindness that allowed for distance while acknowledging a shared history. Sarah read the letter in the yard, sitting on the stoop with the sun brown on her arms. She didn't read it aloud.
That night, for the first time in a long time, she slept without the weight of denial tucked against her ribs. She could not change what had been done. She could only stand with the truth and let action be the mortar of repair. Calb proposed to her on an evening when the stars were like scattered nails across the sky. He did it in a way that made sense for him, not with a ring flashed before the eyes of the world, but with a hand taken in the kitchen, a promise made heavy with the everyday. I want to keep this roof with you, he said, if you will let me. Sarah answered slowly,
not because she had doubts about his affection, but because promises had been broken and mended in ways that had left their solder unavoidable. She nodded, then let the word fill the kitchen like flour dust. The children clapped in a sudden burst of honest joy, and even Emma, who had watched the exchange with a complexity that revealed she was younger and wiser in a single breath, allowed a small smile. Their marriage was not the end of the story of what Sarah had done. It did not erase the child she had given up, nor did it turn away the fault of fear. But it did create a new truth, that people could choose to stand with one another after the worst had been exposed. The family became a tapestry not of perfect threads, but of those who had chosen to keep stitching. Years passed with the gentleness of a stitched seam. Children grew taller. Seasons moved like an accordion, pulling and letting go. Mary remained a memory that Sarah carried without feeling less because of it. She visited the locket now and then, and sometimes she took Hannah, the child of a neighbor who loved songs, and taught her an old lullaby. She found that the work of motherhood could be performed in ways that were not purely biological, in preparing a child's breakfast, in bearing the scorch of a fever, in showing up when the weather turned. Sometimes in the quiet, Sarah would walk the ridge outside the house where the fields rolled and the horizon felt like a hand reaching forever. She would think of the child whose name she had kept hidden, and of the life that had continued because of hard choices made in youth. Regret lived with her like an old friend who was never entirely banished. Sometimes it spoke loud and sharp, sometimes it was a quiet murmur. The truth, more severe than her initial lie, had been the risk of a heart kept behind a lie to protect itself. Yet once that truth was placed on the table, the family discovered it could be worn without burning them. It left scars, certainly. Trust was repaired by effort rather than words. Caleb's commitment, Emma's gradual opening, the children's laughter returning. These were not bandages, but steady stitches that meant the family would hold. On a late autumn evening, when the light went thin and the air felt like glass, Sarah sat on the porch with the locket in her hand.
The children were inside, and Caleb was moving about by the stove, the small domestic motions, a sound she had come to crave. She opened the locket and let the memory of a tiny curl rest in her palm. The thing that had once made her hide now lived as a quiet relic. There was no triumphant reunion, no dramatic freeing. Instead, there was a long, faithful life continuing to be built. "Did you ever think you could come back?" Emma asked her once, blunt in the way only a young person can be. "I thought about it," Sarah said. "I thought I would be turned away. I thought I could never risk loving again. But I was wrong. People can choose, and the choice to stay, day after day, that's also a kind of love." Emma considered the words. "Then stay," she said. "Stay honest." "I will," Sarah promised. The seasons kept coming. The house kept living. Samuel grew into a boy who loved the sound of the creek and who never forgot the nights his fever had been cradled by steady hands. He called Sarah Maddie sometimes in his childish lapses, a name he had once known only from lullabies and borrowed memories. He was a softness Sarah accepted his grace. In the end, the lie that had been told in a mercantile doorway under a sun that made the dust shimmer had yielded a truer thing, a life that could face its past without letting it be the only measure of future days. The truth, even worse, had been a wound she bore, and its naming had led not to theatrical downfall, but to work, to confession, to a painstaking rebuilding. The family that took her in did not become perfect. They became everyday people who had chosen one another despite the things that hurt. If there is a kind of miracle here, it is the small one that happens when a person decides, over and over, to show up. The house stood through storms and small triumphs. The children learned how to hold a secret that had been redeemed into honesty, and Sarah learned that being known was not the same as being rejected. On the porch, when the last of the day's heat slid into a cool and gentle dusk, Sarah closed the locket and slipped it back inside her blouse. She looked out across the fields where the horses moved like slow breathing, and she let herself believe that sometimes imperfect families become the most faithful kind of home. If this story found you, and you'd like to hear more like it, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to know that truth, confession, and steady care can rebuild what fear once broke.